The haptic vest strapped to my chest kicked like a dying heart, a relentless, stuttering vibration that told me the 911 lines weren't just busy, they were hemorrhaging. I didn't need to hear the sirens to know Los Angeles was screaming. On the bank of monitors in front of me, the grainy feed from a traffic cam at Wilshire and Western showed a silver Tesla plowing into a crowd of pedestrians who weren't running, they were pouncing. My hearing aids were cranked to their maximum setting, producing nothing but a high-pitched, electric whine that set my teeth on edge. But the visual input was loud enough. A woman in a shredded Lululemon leggings was currently kneeling on the hood of that Tesla, her face buried in the driver's neck, pulling upward with the kind of raw, animalistic force that shouldn't be possible for a human. The red emergency call light on my console didn't just blink, it stayed solid, a bleeding eye staring at me in the dim light of the dispatch center. I hit the accept button for the TTY text-to-voice bridge, my fingers trembling over the mechanical keyboard. The text scrolled across the screen in jagged bursts. Officer down. Multiple bytes. They are not stopping. Do not send medics. Send the National Guard. The smell of scorched ozone and old coffee filled my booth as the building's backup generators kicked in. A deep thrum I felt in the soles of my boots. Outside the soundproof glass of my station, the main floor of the LAPD Communications Division was a chaotic pantomime. My coworkers were standing up, their headsets discarded, staring at the massive wall-mounted displays that showed the City of Angels dissolving into a literal hellscape. I saw Sarah, a veteran dispatcher who'd handled the 1992 riots, drop her phone and back away from her desk, her mouth open in a silent wail I couldn't hear but felt in the pit of my stomach. The air in the room suddenly changed, a sharp, metallic tang of copper and sulfur drifting through the vents. My vest vibrated again, not a call this time, but the building's internal alarm system. A rhythmic, heavy pulse, code red. Lockdown. I looked toward the heavy steel doors that led to the elevators. And that's when I saw the first splatter of blood hit the glass partition from the outside. It wasn't a spray, it was a thick, wet smear, as if someone had been dragged across the other side. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. I reached for my bag, my hand brushing the cold plastic of my spare batteries, when the floor beneath me buckled. A massive explosion from the basement sent a shockwave through the building that I felt in my very bones, shattering the silence I lived in. The monitors flickered and died, leaving me in a tomb of shadows lit only by the strobing red of the emergency lights. I could see the silhouettes of my colleagues moving frantically in the dark, but then the movements changed. They weren't running anymore. They were lunging. In the strobing light, I saw the supervisor, a man I'd shared in and out with just 4 hours ago, pinned against a file cabinet by something that used to be his assistant. The assistant's teeth were clamped onto his collarbone, and even without my hearing, I could feel the vibration of the bones snapping through the floorboards. I scrambled backward, my chair flipping over with a crash I felt as a dull thud. I was trapped in a glass box in a room full of monsters, and for the first time in my life, I realized that being deaf wasn't just my identity. It was the only reason I hadn't gone insane from the screaming yet. I grabbed my tactical flashlight, the heavy mag light we were all issued, and clicked it on. The beam sliced through the dust and smoke, landing on the door of my booth. The handle was turning. Someone, or something, was trying to get in. I pressed my back against the rear wall, the cold glass biting into my shoulder blades. The door didn't open, it exploded inward as a body was thrown through it. It was Sarah. She looked at me, her eyes wide, her throat a ruin of jagged flesh and pulsing veins. She tried to speak, her lips moving in a frantic, silent plea I couldn't decipher. Behind her, a shadow loomed, a tall, broad-shouldered man in an LAPD uniform, his badge glinting under my flashlight. But his face. Half of his jaw was hanging by a single tendon, and his eyes were nothing but milky, clouded spheres of hunger. He stepped over Sarah, his movements jerky and disjointed, like a marionette with cut strings. I felt the vibration of his footsteps, heavy, wet slaps on the linoleum. I didn't have a gun. I didn't have a way to call for help that didn't involve a keyboard I couldn't reach. I lunged to the side, swinging the mag light with everything I had. The heavy metal connected with the side of the officer's head with a sickening vibration that traveled up my arm, but he didn't even flinch. He just turned, his broken jaw swinging, and lunged. I rolled under the desk, my lungs burning with the smell of blood and fire. I kicked out, my boot connecting with his shin, and scrambled toward the broken door. The main dispatch floor was a slaughterhouse. In the flickering red light, I saw dozens of them, hunched over desks, dragging bodies across the carpet. I had to get to the stairs. I had to get out of downtown. My apartment in Silver Lake felt like it was on the other side of the moon. I stayed low, moving between the cubicles, using the vibrations in the floor to gauge where the shamblers were. Every time a heavy foot hit the ground, I paused, my hand against the carpet, feeling the rhythm of the hunt. I reached the stairwell door and pushed it open, the cold air from the concrete shaft hitting my face. I started to climb, my breath coming in ragged gasps that I could feel vibrating in my throat. I reached the 4th floor landing when I stopped dead. My hearing aids, which had been giving me nothing but static, suddenly picked up a signal. It wasn't a sound from the room, it was a radio frequency bleed over. A voice, crackling and distorted, but clear enough for the digital processing to kick in. Don't go to the roof. They're waiting on the roof. The basement is breached. If you can hear this, God help you. I looked up the stairwell, then down. The vibration in the handrail started then. A rhythmic, synchronized thumping. Not one person. Not two. Dozens. They were coming up the stairs from the basement, and they were coming down from the roof. I was caught in the middle. I slammed my back against the concrete wall, my eyes darting to the floor-level door. It was labeled maintenance/electrical. I ducked inside and threw the bolt just as the first heavy impact hit the outside of the door. The vibration was so intense it rattled my teeth. I stood in the pitch-black room, the smell of copper growing stronger, and slowly turned my flashlight toward the back of the small space. There, huddled in the corner, was a small girl, no older than 6, clutching a blood-stained teddy bear. She was looking at me, her eyes wide with terror, her lips moving. I leaned in, trying to read her lips in the bouncing light of my mag light. She wasn't asking for help. She was pointing behind me. I felt a cold, wet breath on the back of my neck, a sensation so visceral it bypassed my ears and went straight to my spine. I didn't hear the snarl, but I felt the low-frequency growl ripple through the very air I was breathing, and as I started to turn, I realized the girl wasn't pointing at a person. She was pointing at the ventilation duct, which was currently being kicked open from the inside. I didn't wait for the vent cover to hit the floor. My body moved on a surge of adrenaline that felt like a bolt of cold lightning down my spine. I lunged forward, grabbing the girl by her thin waist and sweeping her off her feet just as the metal grate clattered onto the concrete floor with a soundless impact. That sent a tremor through the soles of my boots. I didn't look back to see what was emerging. I didn't need to. The girl's face told the entire story. Her jaw dropped, her eyes rolled back in a near faint of pure, unadulterated terror. And she began to scream, a scream I couldn't hear, but I could see the strain in her throat. The way her small body convulsed with the effort of a sound that was likely piercing enough to shatter glass. I pivoted, my mag light sweeping the room in a frantic arc, and caught a glimpse of a pale, elongated limb, too long, too thin, the skin a translucent, sickly gray, hooking around the edge of the duct. This wasn't one of the shambling wrecks from the street. This was something that had been living in the walls. The heavy door behind me groaned. The bolt was holding, but the frame was beginning to buckle under the rhythmic, violent thudding from the hallway. I was trapped between a hammer and an anvil. I shoved the girl into the narrow gap between two massive, humming transformers, pressing my finger to my lips in the universal sign for silence. Though I knew it was useless if she couldn't stop her primal shrieking. I turned just as the creature from the vent dropped to the floor. It didn't land like a person, it landed like an insect, its joints snapping into place with a fluidity that made my stomach churn. It was wearing the tattered remains of a janitor's uniform, but the chest had been hollowed out, and its jaw hung at an impossible angle, held together by strings of blackened sinew. Its eyes were milky white, devoid of pupils, fixed on the space where I had just been standing. I didn't have a gun. All I had was the mag light and a heavy-duty screwdriver I'd scavenged from a desk 3 floors up. I gripped the light like a club and the screwdriver like a dagger. The creature's head snapped toward me. I felt the vibration of its hiss, a high-frequency trill that made the air around my ears feel thick and heavy. It lunged. I didn't think. I reacted with the muscle memory of a man who had spent 10 years visualizing worst-case scenarios from a padded chair in a dispatch center. I swung the mag light with everything I had. The heavy aluminum casing connected with the creature's temple. I felt the sickening crunch through the handle, the vibration of bone giving way. Its head whipped to the side, but it didn't go down. It hissed again, a soundless spray of black bile hitting my chest, and its clawed hand swiped across my shoulder. Pain, sharp and searing, blossomed across my collarbone. I felt the heat of my own blood soaking into my shirt instantly. I backed away, my heels catching on a bundle of thick cables, and I stumbled. The creature was on me in a heartbeat, its weight surprisingly light, its bones feeling like dried bamboo. I jammed the screwdriver upward, aiming for the soft palate of its open mouth. I felt the resistance, then a sickening pop as the metal rod slid through the roof of its mouth and into its brain. The creature shuddered, its limbs twitching in a violent, rhythmic spasm that sent shocks through my own arms, and then it went limp. I pushed the foul-smelling carcass off me, gasping for air that tasted like ozone and rot. I looked back at the girl. She was curled in a ball, her eyes fixed on the door. The thumping had stopped. That was worse. Silence, for me, was the status quo, but the cessation of movement meant the things outside had changed their plan. Then, the floor beneath my feet hummed. Not the steady vibration of the transformers, but a deep, rhythmic mechanical thrum. I looked up. The emergency red lights in the room began to pulse. Slow. Steady. I knew that pattern. In this building, the Pacific Alpha Tower, that wasn't a fire alarm. It was the warning for the Halon 1301 fire suppression system. The outbreak had likely triggered a thermal event in the server rooms below, and the building's automated systems were about to flood the lower and middle tiers with gas that would extinguish the fire by displacing every molecule of oxygen in the room. I had maybe 3 minutes before we suffocated. I grabbed the girl's hand, pulling her out from behind the transformer. She resisted at first, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear, but I pointed at the pulsing red light and then mine choking, clutching my throat. She understood. She was smart, scary smart for a 6-year-old in the apocalypse. She pointed toward the door, then shook her head violently. She pointed up, toward the vent the creature had come from. It was our only way out, but my shoulder was screaming, the blood loss making the edges of my vision fray and spark. I hauled the creature's body away from the vent opening and looked up. The duct was narrow, but it led to the secondary ventilation shaft. If we could climb, we could get above the Halon line. I boosted the girl up first. She climbed like a squirrel, disappearing into the dark metal tunnel. I followed, gritting my teeth as I hauled my weight up with one good arm. The pain in my shoulder was a white-hot spike, every movement sending a fresh wave of agony through my torso. I managed to wedge myself inside just as a heavy, metallic clunk echoed through the building, the sound of the ventilation dampers closing. The air in the room below began to haze with a fine, invisible mist. I scrambled upward, my fingers clawing at the rivets in the sheet metal, the girl's sneakers just inches from my face. We crawled for what felt like miles, the darkness absolute except for the occasional flicker of my flashlight. The air was getting thinner. My lungs felt like they were being squeezed by a giant hand. My heart was a frantic drum against the metal floor of the duct. Then, a new vibration. Sharp. Rapid. Asterisk rat-tat-tat-tat. Asterisk. I stopped. I pressed my cheek against the metal. That wasn't the zombies. That was high-caliber gunfire. And it was close. I looked through a small slat in the ductwork and saw the floor below, the 14th floor, the executive suites. A group of men in tactical gear, wearing full-face respirators and carrying suppressed carbines, were moving through the hallway with professional precision. They weren't rescuing people. I watched as one of them kicked open an office door, saw a huddled group of office workers, and opened fire. There was no hesitation. No orders given. Just the clinical, rhythmic flash of muzzles. The cleaners. I'd heard rumors of containment protocols during the initial 911 calls before the lines went dead, private security firms hired by the board of directors to sanitize the assets and ensure no biological data left the building. To them, the girl and I weren't survivors. We were loose ends. We were potential carriers. The girl had seen it too. She was frozen, her small hand covering her mouth to stifle a sob I couldn't hear. I reached out and squeezed her ankle, trying to offer some semblance of comfort I didn't feel. We couldn't stay in the vents. The halon would eventually rise, or the cleaners would toss a thermobaric grenade into the shaft to seal it. We had to move. We reached a junction where the duct opened into a service elevator lobby. I peered through the vent cover. The lobby was empty, but the elevator doors were buckled outward, as if something incredibly heavy had tried to push its way out from the inside. I kicked the vent cover open. I didn't care about the noise anymore. The halon was making my head swim and my coordination was failing. We dropped into the lobby. I landed hard, my injured shoulder hitting the floor first. I didn't scream, but a silent groan tore through my chest as I rolled onto my back, the world spinning in nauseating circles. The girl was over me in a second, her small hands pulling at my tactical vest, her lips moving frantically. I focused, squinting through the haze of pain. "They're coming," she was saying. Asterisk. "The men. They're coming up the stairs." Asterisk. I struggled to my feet, using the wall for support. The wound on my shoulder was deep, 4 jagged furrows that looked angry and purple. I didn't have time to worry about infection. I looked at the elevator doors. One was hanging by a single roller. I peered into the dark shaft. The elevator car was stuck between the 14th and 15th floors, wedged at an angle. Below it, in the darkness of the pit, I could see movement, a sea of writhing limbs and glowing, pale eyes. The horde was trapped down there, thousands of them, a living carpet of hunger. But there was a ladder. A rusted, yellow-painted emergency ladder bolted to the side of the shaft. It led up to the roof. I pointed to the ladder, then to the girl. She looked at the dark drop, then at me. She was terrified, but she nodded. I helped her over the edge of the buckled door. She grabbed the rungs and began to climb, her small frame silhouetted against the dim emergency lights of the shaft. I was right behind her, my one good hand gripping the cold metal, my injured arm hanging uselessly at my side. Every rung was a battle. My vision was tunneling. The halon was reaching us now, a heavy, suffocating blanket that made every breath a labor of godlike effort. We reached the 20th floor, the top of the shaft, when the building shook. An explosion. The cleaners were using charges to clear the stairwells. The ladder groaned, the bolts anchoring it to the concrete vibrating violently. I looked up. The exit hatch to the roof was just 10 feet away. The girl was already there, pushing against the heavy iron plate. It wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside. She looked down at me, her face a mask of despair. She hammered on the hatch, her small fists making no sound in my world, but I could see the vibration in the metal. I climbed up next to her, wedging my shoulder against the ladder to keep from falling. I reached up and shoved the hatch. It didn't move. It was reinforced. Then, the vibration changed. A rhythmic, heavy pounding from the other side of the hatch. Someone was out there. The girls saw it first. The hatch began to turn. The wheel on the center of the plate spun rapidly. I felt a surge of hope. Maybe a rescue team? Maybe the National Guard. The hatch swung open, and the blinding Los Angeles sun poured into the dark shaft, momentarily searing my retinas. I squinted, my hand shielding my eyes. A figure stood over the opening. He wasn't wearing a respirator. He was wearing an expensive, tailored suit, now ruined and covered in blood. He held a custom-made SIG sauer pointed directly at my forehead. It was the CEO of the company, the man whose voice I had heard 100 times on the internal briefing loops. Behind him, the roof was a graveyard. Dozens of bodies, all in suits, all executed with a single shot to the head. And beyond him, parked on the helipad, was a sleek, black helicopter, its rotors beginning to turn. The downdraft sending a whirlwind of grit and paper into the shaft. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His eyes were cold, calculated. He looked at the girl, then at me, then at the gun. He wasn't looking for survivors to rescue. He was waiting for his flight, and we were witnesses to the exit strategy he'd enacted for his board members. Behind us, from the darkness of the shaft below, a soundless scream erupted. Not from the girl. From the things climbing the ladder. The runner, from the electrical room, hadn't been alone. I felt the vibration of the ladder as hundreds of hands gripped the rungs below us. They were fast. They were coming. I looked at the CEO. I looked at the gun. I looked at the girl. The man in the suit reached down, but not to help us. He grabbed the handle of the hatch to pull it shut, his finger tightening on the trigger of the pistol. If he closed that hatch, we were dead, either shredded by the things on the ladder or suffocated by the gas below. If I fought him, he'd shoot us both. At that exact moment, the building groaned again. A massive, low-frequency shudder that I felt in my teeth. The helicopter was lifting off, the gale-force winds of the rotors pulling the hatch upward, fighting the CEO's grip. The man stumbled, his aim wavering for a fraction of a second. I had one choice. One moment. I looked at the girl and pointed to the ledge of the hatch. Then I looked down. The first of the pale, gray hands was visible now, just 10 feet below my boots, its fingers elongated and claw-like, snapping at the air. I didn't have the strength to climb out and fight him. I didn't have the air left in my lungs to scream. I grabbed the girl's waist with my good arm and, with a final, agonizing heave, I threw her toward the opening, praying she could grab the edge. As I did, the CEO recovered his balance and leveled the gun at my chest. I saw the muzzle flash, a bright, silent spark in the sunlight. I felt the impact. It wasn't like the movies. It was a dull, heavy thud that knocked the remaining breath out of me. I fell backward, my grip on the ladder failing. As I plummeted into the darkness of the shaft, the last thing I saw was the girl's hand reaching out for me against the blue LA sky. And the CEO's cold, panicked face as he realized the runner had just crested the lip of the hatch behind him. I hit something soft and squirming, and then the world went black. The darkness wasn't a void, it was a weight. It pressed against my eyes, my skin, and the raw, screaming hole in my chest where the CEO's bullet had found its home. I didn't hear the impact, I never hear anything, but I felt it in the way the world shattered into 1,000 jagged vibrations. The fall felt like an eternity, a slow-motion descent through a throat of concrete and steel. Until the transition from air to matter happened with a sickening, wet crunch. I didn't hit the floor. I hit the harvest. The soft and squirming thing beneath me wasn't a mattress or a pile of trash, it was a heap of bodies. A literal mountain of the fallen that had been tossed down this shaft like discarded meat. Some were cold and stiff, providing a gruesome cushion, but others, the ones at the top of the pile, were still twitching, their nervous systems firing in a mindless, post-human hunger. I lay there for a long time, the copper tang of my own blood filling my mouth, mixing with the cloying, sweet stench of rot that hung in the stagnant air of the sub-basement. My vision was a blurred mess of gray and black, punctuated by the rhythmic, red throb of my pulse behind my eyelids. Every time my heart beat, a fresh wave of agony radiated from my collarbone. I reached up with my good hand, my fingers trembling, and felt the wetness. The bullet had entered just below the clavicle. It felt like a hot coal was being pressed into my marrow. I tried to breathe, but my left lung felt heavy, like it was filling with lead. I forced myself to stay conscious. If I passed out here, on this altar of the dead, I would never wake up. I rolled off the pile, my movement triggering a cascade of limbs. Beneath me, a gray, withered hand clamped onto my boot. I didn't scream, I couldn't, but the jolt of adrenaline was enough to clear my vision. I kicked out, the vibration of the impact traveling up my leg as my heavy heel connected with the jawbone, snapping it like dry kindling. I scrambled away on my elbows, dragging my useless lower half across the grit-covered concrete until my back hit a cold, damp wall. I was in a maintenance tunnel, far below the luxury of the executive suites. Above me, the hatch was a tiny square of mocking blue light, hundreds of feet up. I thought of the girl. I hoped she had made it. I hoped she was running across the rooftops of a dying city, far away from the man who had tried to kill us both. I looked down at my arm. In the dim, flickering light of a distant emergency lamp, I saw it. It wasn't just a gunshot wound. During the fall, or perhaps during the struggle on the pile, something had caught me. On my forearm, just above the wrist, was a jagged, semicircular tear. It wasn't a scrape from the ladder. The edges were bruised, the skin shredded in a way that only human teeth can manage. The realization hit me harder than the bullet. I was a 911 dispatcher. I had spent years listening to the worst moments of people's lives through a headset, translating their terror into coordinates for help that often came too late. I knew the protocols. I knew the timeline. The infection didn't care about my survival instincts, or the fact that I had saved a child. It was a biological clock, and it had just started ticking. The impossible choice didn't feel like a choice at all in that moment, it felt like a sentence. I looked at the wound, then at the heavy, rusted fire door 10 feet away. Beside the door sat a discarded toolkit, likely dropped by a frantic mechanic weeks ago. I crawled toward it, every inch of movement a battle against the darkness encroaching on the edges of my sight. I found what I needed, a heavy-duty bolt cutter and a portable blowtorch used for soldering pipes. My mind was a chaotic storm of memories. The way the sun looked hitting the Hollywood sign, the smell of my mother's kitchen, the silence of my apartment. I couldn't die like this. I couldn't become one of the things in the pit. I stripped off my belt and looped it around my upper arm, biting down on a piece of rubber tubing I found in the kit to keep from biting through my tongue. The pain of the gunshot was a dull roar now, eclipsed by the cold, calculated terror of what I had to do. I didn't have a saw. I didn't have an anesthetic. I only had the blunt force of the cutters and the cauterizing heat of the torch. I looked at the bite again. The veins around it were already darkening, a necrotic map spreading toward my heart. I thought of the CO's face, the panic, the cowardice. He was the one who belonged down here, not me. I positioned the bolt cutters. The metal was cold against my skin. I closed my eyes, picturing the girl's hand reaching for the sky. I pushed down. The world didn't explode, it imploded. The sensation wasn't a sound, but a massive, jarring vibration that shook my entire skeleton. My vision went white, then red, then a color I have no name for. I felt the bones snap, a sickening, internal thud that I felt in my teeth. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I fumbled for the torch, the blue flame hissing in the silence I've known since birth. When the heat hit the raw stump, I finally lost it. I didn't scream, but my body convulsed, my head slamming against the concrete as I smelled the scent of my own charred flesh. I don't know how long I lay there in the aftermath. The world was a haze of smoke and agony. My left arm ended in a blackened, mangled knot of agony, and my chest felt like it was being crushed by an invisible hand. But I was alive. The clock had stopped, or at least slowed down. I used the last of my strength to wrap the stump in a greasy rag and a roll of duct tape from the kit. I was a ghost now, a fragment of a human being drifting through the guts of Los Angeles. I managed to stand, leaning heavily against the wall. The hallway stretched out before me, a labyrinth of shadows and steam pipes. I began to move, my gait a lurching, uneven shuffle. I had to find a way out. I had to find a way to the surface, even if the surface was a graveyard. As I moved, I felt a rhythmic thumping through the floorboards. It wasn't my heart. It was something heavier, something rhythmic and coordinated. It was the sound of 1,000 feet, a tide of something massive moving through the subway tunnels that connected to this basement. I reached a junction where the maintenance hall opened into a cavernous loading bay. The emergency lights here were stronger, casting long, dancing shadows across the floor. I stopped. My breath hitched in my throat. In the center of the bay, standing over a pile of crates, was the CEO. He wasn't dead. He had fallen, or been dragged down, but he had survived the runner. He looked different, though. His expensive suit was shredded, and his face was a mask of gore. He wasn't turned, not yet, but he was pinned under a fallen heavy equipment rack, his legs crushed. He saw me. He didn't know I was deaf, and his mouth moved frantically, his eyes wide with a plea for mercy. I stood there, a one-armed, gut-shot specter dripping blood onto the floor, and I just watched him. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. I felt the cold, hard logic of the dispatcher I used to be. There were no more units to send. There was no more help on the way. He had fired the bullet that was currently killing me, and now he wanted me to lift the weight off his legs. I looked past him, into the darkness of the tunnel he had been trying to crawl toward. In the gloom, I saw eyes. Not 2 or 10, but dozens. The runner, from the roof, wasn't alone. It had been a scout. The things in the tunnel were standing perfectly still, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. They weren't the slow, stumbling shamblers from the early days of the outbreak. These were the new ones, lean, pale, and coordinated. They moved with a predatory grace that suggested a hive mind, a collective intelligence that had replaced their human souls. I looked back at the CEO. I could see the vibrations of his screams now, the way his chest heaved and his throat strained. He was making enough noise to wake the city. He was a dinner bell. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small brass whistle I had carried since I was a child, a gift from my father to signal for help if I ever got lost. I didn't blow it. I just dropped it on the floor. The clink of the metal was something I couldn't hear, but I felt the tiny vibration of it hitting the concrete. The CEO's eyes followed the whistle, then looked back at me, realizing I wasn't going to help. He began to thrash, his movements frantic and loud. The eyes in the tunnel shifted. The first of them stepped into the light, a woman in a tattered nurse's uniform, her jaw hanging at an impossible angle. Her fingers elongated into hooks of bone. Then another. And another. They didn't run. They stalked. They knew they had us trapped in this concrete box. I turned away from him, my eyes searching the walls for an exit. I saw it, a heavy steel ladder leading to a ventilation grate near the ceiling. It was 20 feet up. With 2 arms, it would have been a challenge. With 1 arm and a hole in my chest, it was a suicide mission. But the alternative was the teeth. I began to climb. Every pull was a descent into a new circle of hell. I used my teeth to help grip the rungs, the copper taste of blood and rust filling my senses. Behind me, the vibrations changed. The rhythmic thumping of the CEO's screams stopped being a rhythm and became a chaotic, staccato series of impacts. I didn't have to see it to know what was happening. I felt the vibrations of the things hitting him, the tearing of fabric, the wet snap of tendons. The air in the bay grew heavy with the scent of fresh blood, a hot, metallic cloud that made my stomach churn. I was halfway up when the vibration stopped. The bay went silent, a heavy, expectant silence that I could feel in the marrow of my bones. I froze, my single hand clamped onto the rusted rung, my legs trembling with exhaustion. I didn't look down. I couldn't. I kept my eyes on the grate, just 5 feet away. If I could just push it open, I could crawl into the ducts and maybe, just maybe, find a way to the streets. Then, the ladder shook. It wasn't a violent shake, but a steady, rhythmic vibration. Someone, or something, was climbing up after me. I risked a glance downward. The CEO was gone, replaced by a red smear on the concrete. The things were gathered at the base of the ladder, looking up with milky, unblinking eyes. But they weren't the ones climbing. The runner, the one from the roof, the one with the claw-like fingers, was halfway up the ladder. It was moving with a terrifying, insect-like speed, its movements fluid and silent. It didn't have a face anymore, just a mass of scar tissue and a row of jagged, yellow teeth. It looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of something in its eyes. Not hunger. Not rage. Recognition. I reached the top, my fingers fumbling with the latch of the grate. It was rusted shut. I slammed my shoulder against it, the impact sending a jolt of agony through my gunshot wound that nearly made me black out. It didn't budge. I tried again, my vision swimming, the vibrations of the runner's ascent getting stronger, closer. I could feel the air shifting as it reached out for my boot. I looked around wildly. To my right, a thick steam pipe ran parallel to the ceiling. If I could jump to it, I might be able to reach a secondary vent. But the gap was 4 feet. 4 feet of empty space, 60 feet above a concrete floor covered in monsters, with one arm and a dying body. I looked down at the runner. Its hand was inches from my ankle. I looked at the grate. I looked at the pipe. And then I saw it, the impossible choice I hadn't seen before. The pipe wasn't just a pipe, it was the main pressurized line for the building's old boiler system. A heavy, brass valve sat right at the junction. If I opened it, the superheated steam would blast the ladder, incinerating the runner and anything else nearby. But it would also cook me alive where I stood, pinned against the ceiling. I could die by the teeth, or I could die by the fire. My hand moved to the valve. My fingers, slick with blood and sweat, gripped the cold metal. I looked one last time at the tiny sliver of light coming through the grate, a reminder of the world I was leaving behind. I thought of the 911 calls I had answered, the voices I had held in the dark, the lives I had tried to save with nothing but words and a keyboard. I had survived the outbreak. I had survived the fall. I had survived the bullet. The runner's fingers closed around my ankle, its grip like a vice. I felt the sharp prick of its claws sinking into my skin. I looked down into its void of a mouth, and I didn't feel afraid anymore. I felt a strange, cold clarity. I began to turn the valve. The metal groaned, a vibration that started in my fingertips and raced up my arm, through my chest, and into my very soul. The first hiss of steam began to leak from the seal, a white, scorching cloud that blurred the world. The runner hissed, its grip tightening, its body tensing for the final pull that would drag me down into the dark. I gave the valve one final, violent twist. The world exploded in a roar of white heat and screaming metal. The pressure was a physical wall, slamming into me, pinning me against the grate as the atmosphere turned to liquid fire. I felt my skin blister, felt the hair on my arms singe away, but I didn't let go. I watched as the runner was engulfed, its pale skin turning black in an instant, its silent scream lost in the tempest of steam. As the ladder began to buckle under the heat and the weight, I felt the grate above me finally give way. The pressure of the steam blowing it outward like a cork from a bottle. I was lifted, not by my own strength, but by the sheer force of the blast. I was launched into the dark, narrow throat of the ventilation duct, my body a charred, broken wreck, as the world below me turned into a furnace. I crawled. I don't know how. My mind was gone, replaced by a primal, lizard brain urge to move away from the heat. I dragged my mangled stump and my lead-heavy chest through the soot and the dust, the air getting thinner, colder. And then I stopped. The duct didn't lead to the roof. It didn't lead to the street. It opened into a small, windowless room filled with flickering monitors and rows of silent server racks. It was a security hub, deep in the heart of the building. And sitting in the center of the room, lit by the ghostly glow of a dozen screens, was someone I hadn't expected to see. It was the girl. She wasn't running. She wasn't safe. She was sitting in a chair, her eyes fixed on the monitors, her hands moving across a keyboard with a terrifying, mechanical precision. She didn't look up as I tumbled out of the vent and collapsed onto the floor. She didn't look up as I gasped for air, my charred lungs burning with every breath. She just kept typing. I looked at the screens. They weren't showing the building. They were showing the city. LA was burning, but it wasn't a chaotic fire. It was a pattern. The hordes of runners were moving through the streets like a massive biological processor, directed by the data flowing from this room. The girl finally turned her head. Her eyes weren't the eyes of the child I had saved on the roof. They were cold, luminous, and filled with a terrifying, ancient intelligence. She looked at my mangled arm, my bullet-torn chest, and the blackened skin of my face. She didn't use sign language. She didn't speak. She just pointed to a second chair, and a second keyboard, and the words that began to scroll across the main monitor in a bright, neon green. Asterisk, the dispatcher is online. The harvest begins. Asterisk. I felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the steam or the bullet. I looked at the keyboard, then at the girl, then at the screens showing the end of the world. My hand, my only hand, reached for the keys. Outside, the first of the massive, steel-reinforced doors to the security hub began to buckle under the weight of something much larger than a runner. The real outbreak was just beginning. The keys beneath my fingers felt like frozen shards of glass, but as I pressed them, the tactile feedback sent a jolt of electricity straight through my ravaged nervous system. I wasn't just typing. I was plugged into the terminal consciousness of a dying megalopolis. The girl stood over me, her small, pale hand resting on the back of my neck. Where her skin touched mine, I didn't feel warmth. I felt a hum, a low-frequency vibration that bypassed my ruined ears and resonated directly in my skull. It was a symphony of data, a million screaming voices converted into binary streams of movement, heat signatures, and biological imperatives. On the screens, Los Angeles was no longer a map of streets and landmarks. It was a circulatory system. The red lines weren't traffic anymore. They were the migratory patterns of the infected, thousands of them moving in perfect, horrifying synchronization toward the high-density pockets of survivors hiding in the subways, the high-rises, and the fortified bunkers of the elite. The harvest was the systematic liquidation of the human resistance, and I was the one holding the compass. My vision blurred, the neon green text on the monitor bleeding into the darkness of my periphery. I tried to pull my hand away, but my muscles refused to obey. I was a part of the machine now, a biological relay in a circuit designed by something that viewed humanity as nothing more than raw material. The heavy steel doors behind us groaned, the metal screeching as it bowed inward. I couldn't hear the sound, but I felt the pressure change in the room, a heavy, suffocating thrum that rattled my teeth. Whatever was outside was massive, a concentrated weight of flesh and bone that made the runners look like insects. The girl didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the screen, her pupils dilating until they swallowed the irises whole. Route them, the screen flashed. Asterisk optimize the flow. Asterisk I looked at the icons representing the remaining police precincts and emergency shelters. I saw the heat signatures of families huddled in the basement of the Wilshire Federal Building. If I touched the key, I would reroute the primary swarm, thousands of the Goliaths and leeches, straight into their ventilation shafts. My heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against my cracked ribs. I was a dispatcher. My entire life had been dedicated to being the voice in the dark, the thread of hope that pulled people out of the fire. Now, I was the one lighting the match. I looked at my mangled arm, the flesh gray and sloughing off, the infection from the initial bite finally reaching my heart. I was already dead. The virus was just keeping the lights on so I could finish the job. The doors erupted. The soundless explosion of debris sent a shockwave through the room that knocked me sideways, my headset tearing away from my head. I didn't fall, though. The girl's hand tightened on my neck, anchoring me to the chair with a strength that defied her small frame. Through the dust and the strobe of emergency red lights, I saw them. They weren't just zombies. They were amalgamations, limbs, torsos, and heads fused together into a pulsing, multi-limbed nightmare that filled the entire corridor. It was a wall of wet gray meat, eyes peering out from armpits and chests, all of them focused on the girl. They didn't attack. They knelt. The collective vibration of their presence was so intense I vomited blood onto the keyboard. The girl looked at the mess I'd made, then back at me. She didn't have a face of a child anymore. It was a mask of cold, calculating hunger. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of ozone and copper, and for a second, I thought I heard a voice. Not a sound, but a thought echoing in the silence of my deafness. Asterisk become the architect. Asterisk. In that moment, something snapped. The years of trauma, the thousands of calls I'd taken from people screaming in their final moments. The weight of every life I couldn't save, it all fused into a single, white-hot spark of defiance. I realized that if I was the processor, then I had the power to crash the system. I didn't reroute the swarm to the shelters. My fingers began to fly, blurring across the keys with the speed born of pure desperation. I accessed the city's emergency infrastructure, the things they never tell the public about. I bypassed the fire suppression systems in the industrial districts. I opened the gas mains in the port of Los Angeles. I overrode the safety protocols on the massive electrical substations that fed the grid. The girl realized what I was doing a split second too late. Her hand clamped onto my throat, her fingernails digging into my windpipe, but I didn't stop. I looked her in those ancient, terrifying eyes and I smiled through the blood. I wasn't saving the world. I was burning it down so they couldn't have it. I hit the final sequence, asterisk global system purge. Asterisk. The world didn't end with a bang for me. It ended with a blinding, white flash that erased the screens, the monsters, and the girl. The last thing I felt was the security hub buckling as the underground gas lines ignited. A subterranean sunstroke that turned the concrete into glass. Then, there was the silence. Not the silence of my deafness, but a true, hollow emptiness. I woke up in the gray light of a morning that shouldn't have existed. I was lying on a slab of cracked asphalt, miles away from the hub. My clothes were fused to my skin, a patchwork of charred fabric and melted plastic. The pain was gone, replaced by a terrifying, hollow numbness. I tried to move my left arm, but there was nothing there but a blackened stump cauterized by the heat. I rolled onto my back, my vision hazy and flickering like a dying bulb. Los Angeles was a graveyard of blackened pillars. The sky was a bruised purple, choked with the soot of 1,000,000 incinerated lives. There were no sounds of birds, no wind, not even the moans of the infected. I had succeeded. I had triggered a firestorm that had gutted the city's core, incinerating the harvest before it could spread. But as I looked at my remaining hand, I saw the truth. The skin wasn't just burnt. Beneath the charred surface, I could see the faint, rhythmic pulse of neon green veins. The virus hadn't died in the fire. It had adapted. It had used the heat to fuse with the very minerals of the earth, and it had used me as its shield. I reached up to touch my face, and my fingers met something hard and slick. My skin was turning into something like obsidian, cold and unresponsive. I sat up, the movement cracking the brittle shell of my body. I looked around the ruins of the city I had spent my life trying to protect. There were no survivors. The people in the bunkers, the families in the subways, the firestorm hadn't discriminated. I had saved them from the harvest by giving them to the flames. I stood up, my legs shaking, the balance of my body completely wrong. I started to walk, but I didn't know where. Every step felt like dragging a corpse through the mud. I found a piece of shattered glass from a skyscraper and looked at my reflection. I didn't recognize the man staring back. My eyes were no longer human. They were flat, silver mirrors, reflecting the dead world around me. I tried to scream, but my throat was a cavern of ash. No sound came out. I was a deaf man in a silent world, but now the silence was absolute. I wandered for days, or maybe weeks. Time had lost its meaning. I saw the husks of the Goliaths, their massive bodies turned into charcoal statues in the middle of the streets. I saw the remains of the girl near the ruins of the hub, her body a small, twisted knot of blackened bone. She was dead, but the intelligence she represented wasn't gone. I could feel it in the air, a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was waiting. It was in the soil, in the ash, and in the very marrow of my bones. I reached the coast, the Pacific Ocean, a leaden, oily expanse that didn't even lap against the shore. The water was dead, too. I sat down on the remains of the Santa Monica Pier, the wood groaning under my weight. I looked at the horizon, waiting for a ship, a plane, any sign that the rest of the world had survived what I had done. But there was nothing. Just the endless, gray expanse. I felt a vibration in my chest, a rhythmic tapping that felt like a heartbeat, but it wasn't mine. It was coming from the ground. I put my hand down on the scorched wood and closed my eyes. Through the vibrations, I could feel them. Across the ocean, in cities I had never visited, the harvest was beginning there, too. I wasn't a hero. I was just a delay. And the cost of that delay was my soul. I reached into the pocket of my shredded uniform and found my old dispatcher's badge. It was melted, the silver tarnished into a dull, unrecognizable lump. I threw it into the dead water. It didn't make a splash. It just sank into the blackness. I am the last dispatcher in Los Angeles. I am the one who answered the final call. And as the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the graveyard of my home, I realized the most terrifying thing of all. I wasn't just a survivor. I was the carrier. Every breath I took, every step I made, I was spreading the very thing I had tried to burn away. The green light in my veins pulsed stronger now, a soft glow in the gathering twilight. I wasn't waiting for rescue. I was waiting for the next phase. I leaned back against the piling and stared at the empty sky, my silver eyes wide and unblinking. There was no more pain, no more fear, no more hope. There was only the silence, and the terrible, flickering green light of the end. I am still here. I am still online. And the world is waiting for my next command. I sat there as the stars began to poke through the smog, cold and indifferent. I didn't pray. I didn't cry. I just watched the darkness grow, a deaf witness to a world that had forgotten how to scream. The silence was my only companion, and it was a hungry, hollow thing that would never be satisfied. I closed my eyes, but the images of the burning city were burned into the back of my lids, a permanent broadcast of my failure. I survived, but as I felt the obsidian skin continue to crawl up my neck, I knew that survival was just another word for a slower kind of death. The dispatcher was still on the line, but the line had been cut, and the only thing left was the dial tone of a dead planet. I sat in the ruins, a statue of ash and regret, waiting for the fire to finally go out for good. It never did. The green light just kept pulsing, a beacon in the wasteland, signaling to a void that would never answer. I stayed there until the moon rose, a pale, scarred eye looking down at the mess we had made. I was alone. I was broken. I was the end of the story. And as the cold wind finally began to kick up the ash of the millions I had killed, I felt a single, phantom sensation in my ears, a high-pitched, electronic whine that sounded exactly like a busy signal. The harvest wasn't over. I was just the first crop. I stood up one last time, my body clicking and popping like a cooling engine. I looked toward the mountains, toward the darkness of the interior, and I started to walk. I didn't have a choice. The data was flowing again, a new map forming in the back of my mind. There were more clusters, more survivors, more heat signatures. And I, the great dispatcher, the savior of the firestorm, was being routed toward them. I felt a tear trail down my cheek, but it wasn't salt water. It was thick, black, and smelled of the grave. I wiped it away with a hand that no longer felt like mine and kept walking into the dark. The broadcast was starting again. The frequency was set. And this time, there would be no one left to hear the scream. I am the deaf dispatcher. I survived. And God help anyone who hears me coming.